Welcome to the deep dive. You guys sent in a case, and it is a wild one. Case Srinivas Rao v. D.A. Deepa, decided by the Supreme Court of India back in 2013.
2013, that's right.
Yeah. And what makes this one so interesting, well, just imagine a marriage that completely falls apart just one day after the wedding.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're going to really get into the weeds of the actual court judgment.
Okay.
And believe me, it is a crazy story.
Well, what I think is so interesting about this case is it really shows you some of the issues and the problems with Indian matrimonial law.
Yeah.
Specifically, this idea of mental cruelty as a reason for divorce.
Right.
It's not as easy as you might think.
Well, absolutely. From what I've read, it's just a complete mess of accusations.
Yeah.
Police complaints, dowry demands.
Oh, my God.
Allegations that'll make your jaw drop. It gets really messy really fast.
Yeah, and that's really what the court had to deal with here.
Right.
This case isn't just about a couple falling apart. It makes us ask some really hard questions about individual rights inside a marriage, the pressures that society puts on people, and whether the legal system can even handle these kinds of very personal disputes.
Okay, so before we get into all the legal stuff, can you just kind of set the scene for us? What happened that made this marriage blow up so fast?
So this case, it starts with what I would call like a really sad, but also kind of funny situation.
Okay.
Like imagine it's day 2 of the marriage and the families get into a huge fight.
No way.
Leading to them splitting up right then and there.
Wow.
You could say the honeymoon was over before it even began.
Wow, that's... It's almost like Shakespeare, like a crazy story with passion and betrayal and family drama all within like 48 hours.
It is.
Like, was it just shouted? Was it more than that the judgment mentioned something about like sandals being thrown?
Oh, yeah. It sounds like something out of a Bollywood movie.
Yeah.
And yeah, according to the judge, things got really heated between the families.
Wow.
Like elders shouting at each other and even like shoes being thrown across the room.
No.
And because of that, the couple separated and the marriage was never even consummated.
Wow. Okay, hold on. This was an arranged marriage, right?
Yes.
Do these kinds of family blow-ups happen often in those situations?
So it's a good reminder that in India, families and marriage are like super connected.
Right.
Arranged marriages are still very normal there. And that means families aren't just involved, they're a core part of the whole tradition.
Yeah.
This case shows how much family problems can affect a marriage.
Yeah.
Especially in a culture where arranged marriages are so common.
So we have this crazy separation right from the start. What happens next? Does it turn into this big legal battle?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
The case becomes a he said, she said kind of fight.
Okay.
Both the husband, Mr. Rao, and the wife, Miss Deepa, they tell completely different stories to the court.
Oh, wow.
Mr. Rao says he was treated cruelly, that his wife made up false accusations against him and kept harassing him with lawsuits.
But he's saying he was the victim.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. What about Ms. Deepa? What's her side of the story?
So Ms. Deepa, she comes back with allegations of her own.
Okay.
She says he demanded dowry, that he was abusive, and that she actually wanted to work things out.
So she wanted to stay together.
Yeah, it becomes really complicated for the court.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out the truth with all these emotions and accusations flying around.
Yeah, and it all seems to come down to this idea of mental cruelty, which you mentioned earlier.
Right.
Can you break down what that actually means, like legally in India? How did it play into this specific case?
So in India, mental cruelty basically means that one person in the marriage is acting in a way that creates a really bad environment for the other person.
Okay.
So bad that they're scared or they're being harmed just by living together.
So it has to be really serious.
Yeah. And it's not just about 1 or 2 incidents.
Okay.
It needs to be like a pattern of behavior that's clearly hurting the other person.
Okay. So in this case, Mr. Rao is saying that Mrs. Deepa's actions, specifically some of the things she accused him of, were mental cruelty.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And one really important piece of evidence is a police complaint that Mrs. Deepa filed.
Okay.
It had a very serious accusation against her mother-in-law.
Oh, wow.
An accusation that the court later said was false.
Yeah, I could see how that would be really damaging, especially in India, where family reputation is so important.
Right.
Did the court give any other examples of Ms. Deepa's actions that they thought were mental cruelty?
Yeah, there were a few other legal things that Ms. Deepa did that the court considered.
Okay.
Including, believe it or not, trying to get Mr. Rao fired from his job.
Really?
Yeah. The court saw all of this as a pattern of behavior meant to harass him and make him suffer.
So the court's basically saying even if some of these things on their own might not be enough to be considered legally cruel,
right,
when you put them all together, it shows a clear picture of really bad and a harmful environment.
Yeah.
Did the court say anything about why they thought Mrs. Deepa was acting this way?
Well, it's hard to say for sure with a case like this with so many emotions involved, but there's one detail in the judgment that might give us a clue.
Okay.
Miss Deepa filed a complaint under Section 498A of the Indian Penal Code.
Okay.
This is a law that's all about cruelty by a husband or his family.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Right. This part of Indian law has been controversial for years.
Yeah.
It was designed to protect women from abuse at home.
Okay.
But some people say it's been misused in nasty divorces.
So they're saying it can be used as a weapon.
Yeah.
Okay, so the court might be hinting that Mrs. Deepa, maybe because she was really upset, or maybe because she wanted an advantage in the divorce, might have used this law in a way it wasn't meant to be used.
Yeah, it's definitely another layer of complexity in an already complicated case.
Absolutely. This can't all just be about blaming each other, right?
Yeah.
Didn't the court say that maybe the marriage itself had just fallen apart?
You're exactly right, and that's where things get really interesting from a legal perspective. The Supreme Court said that even though irretrievable breakdown of a marriage wasn't officially a legal reason for divorce in India at that time, this particular marriage was definitely over.
So even though Indian law didn't officially recognize this idea of irreconcilable differences, like we might call it,
right,
the court still saw that this marriage was done.
Yes, they did. And the Supreme Court actually suggested that the law should be changed.
Wow.
To include irretrievable breakdown as an official reason for divorce.
Okay.
They recognize that sometimes a marriage is just over no matter what the legal papers say.
That's a pretty progressive stance. What made them come to that conclusion? Were there specific things about this case that made them think this marriage was beyond saving?
Well, they definitely looked at the whole timeline.
Yeah.
The immediate and intense conflict, the accusations getting worse and worse, the back and forth legal actions.
Right.
It all pointed to a relationship that was so damaged that forcing them to stay married would only cause more pain.
It sounds like they were pushing for a more realistic and humane way of dealing with divorce.
That's exactly.
Recognizing that trying to force a marriage to stay together no matter what can sometimes do more harm than good.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So the court recognized the marriage was over, even though the law hadn't quite caught up yet.
Mm-hmm.
What about like the practical stuff? What did the judgment say about things like alimony or splitting up their stuff?
It did, and this is where the case really highlights another problem.
Okay.
The fact that women in India can be really vulnerable financially, especially after a divorce.
Right.
The Supreme Court awarded Mrs. Deepa a significant amount of alimony to make sure she would be okay financially.
That makes sense. Given the situation in India, it seems like the court was trying to be fair, understanding that divorce can really hurt someone's finances.
Yeah.
Especially women.
It definitely shows the economic realities and how the court tried to make things a little bit easier for Mrs. Deepa.
Yeah.
It also brings up some interesting questions about how individual rights and cultural norms clash within the legal system.
This is fascinating. We've just scratched the surface, and this case already has so many interesting angles.
Yeah, it does.
We'll be right back with more of the deep dive on the case Srinivas Rao v. D.A. Deepa case after a short break.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We are breaking down this super interesting case Srinivas Rao v. D.A. Deepa. It's given us a real look into how complicated Indian matrimonial law can be and how marriage itself is changing.
Right.
It reminds us that relationships are messy and tough, and to handle those challenges, you need to talk openly. Be willing to compromise and get help when you need it.
Yeah, I completely agree.
What I find really interesting is the court saying that the marriage breaking down completely should be a valid reason for divorce in India.
Yeah.
It seems like they're trying to make the law more realistic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The court realized that sometimes even if you try your best, a marriage just can't be saved. And when that happens, making a couple stay legally married just causes more pain.
Yeah.
This case, in a way, started a bigger conversation in India about how marriage is changing in modern times.
You know, it makes me think about how much pressure there is, especially in some cultures and communities, to keep up the appearance of a happy marriage.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
This idea of saving face is really strong in many cultures.
Yeah.
And that can make it so hard for couples to admit they're having problems and actually deal with them.
Yeah.
There's this huge pressure to fit in with what society expects, even when those expectations are hurting you.
And in this case, it seems like the legal battles themselves were part of the reason the marriage couldn't be saved. All the accusations, the complaints, the counterclaims.
Right.
It's like they got stuck in this cycle of fighting.
The judgment actually talks about that.
Really?
The court noticed that all the legal stuff created a really toxic environment.
Yeah.
It made the conflict worse and pushed the couple even further apart. They even said that sometimes forcing a couple to stay legally married in a situation like that could be considered a form of mental cruelty itself.
That's a big statement.
Yeah.
It really challenges this idea that just keeping a marriage legally in place is always the best thing.
Right. It does.
It seems like the court is saying we need to understand that sometimes relationships end. And the law should reflect that.
Yeah.
Let's create a system that allows for a more dignified separation when a marriage is truly over.
Yeah. And remember, this isn't just about the law. It's about our values as a society and what we expect from people.
Right.
This case, even though it happened in India, is part of a global conversation.
Yeah.
About how much freedom individuals should have within a marriage.
Okay. So if we take a step back.
Yeah.
Do you think this case shows us that our view of marriage is changing? Moving away from this traditional idea that it's a lifelong, unbreakable bond?
It's definitely a sign that things are moving in that direction.
Okay.
It's part of a bigger conversation happening in many countries. People are starting to recognize that each person's happiness and their right to choose their own path are the most important things, even within a marriage.
So the court is basically saying, hey, sometimes things just don't work out, and that's okay.
Right.
Let's not make it harder than it needs to be.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important part of the judgment, their emphasis on mediation.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how the Supreme Court almost seemed sad that mediation wasn't tried in this case?
Yeah. It was like they were saying this whole legal mess could have been avoided if they just sat down and talked it out with a mediator.
Exactly. They saw mediation as a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
A chance to calm things down early on, maybe even prevent years of fighting and emotional pain.
Right.
They thought mediation could have led to a more peaceful solution.
Okay.
One that took care of what both people needed and wanted.
It's interesting how the court sees mediation as like the opposite of the way the legal system usually works.
It is, isn't it? They seem to be saying that the legal system, with its focus on winning and losing, often just makes the conflict worse. Especially in situations like divorce, where emotions are so strong.
Right.
Mediation, on the other hand, gives people a place to talk, understand each other, and find compromises.
It makes you wonder if things could have been totally different if they had tried mediation from the beginning.
Yeah.
Maybe they could have reached a solution that worked for both of them without all the anger and bitterness.
It's definitely possible mediation lets couples talk directly,
Right.
work through their problems, and find options that aren't limited by what happens in a courtroom.
Yeah.
It can be especially helpful in cultures where family and social pressure have a big influence on marriage decisions.
Right.
Because it gives them a safe and private place to deal with those complicated issues.
But let's be realistic. Even with the best mediator in the world, isn't it still really tough to find common ground when a relationship has gotten this bad?
You're right. It wouldn't have been easy.
Especially with all the drama going on in their families.
Yeah. But even if mediation hadn't saved the marriage, it might have helped them figure out a more civilized and respectful way to separate their lives.
Okay.
Remember, the point of mediation isn't always to keep the couple together. Sometimes it's about finding the least harmful way to move on.
This has given me a lot to think about, not just about divorce, but about how we deal with conflict in general.
Yeah.
Maybe we could all benefit from trying to use mediation more often when we disagree,
I think so.
whether it's in our personal lives or in our communities.
That's a great point.
This case reminds us that there are other ways to handle things besides fighting it out in court.
Absolutely. It encourages us to look for solutions that focus on understanding each other, communicating well, and respecting each other, even when we're feeling really upset.
It feels like this case, even though it's specific to India and their laws, brings up some really universal questions. Questions about what marriage is, for how complicated human relationships are, and how the law fits into all of that.
Yeah, it challenges us to look at our own beliefs about marriage, and divorce, and how to balance individual freedom with what society expects from us.
It also reminds us that the law, even though it's powerful, isn't always the best or kindest way to deal with really personal problems.
That's so true.
Okay, so we looked at the legal details, the cultural aspects, and the bigger picture of this case.
Right.
But I'm curious, what does all this mean for our listeners? How can they use what we've talked about in their own lives and relationships?
That's a great question. We'll be right back after a quick break to discuss those big questions.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into this case, Srinivas Rao and D.A. Deepa case.
Yeah, it's been fascinating.
And it's shown us how complicated Indian marriage laws can be and how marriage itself is changing.
Right. It really makes you think.
It reminds us that relationships are tricky and full of challenges. And to handle those challenges, we need to talk openly. Be ready to compromise and not be afraid to ask for help when we need it.
I couldn't agree more.
So let's bring it back to our listeners. What can we all learn from this case, and how can we use these ideas in our own lives and relationships? I think one of the biggest takeaways is how important communication is.
Absolutely.
Like, this whole mess might have been avoided if they had just been able to be honest with each other.
Right. This case really shows how important it is to have good communication skills and know how to resolve conflicts.
Yeah.
A lot of times the problem isn't the disagreement itself, it's how we react to it.
Exactly. It's so easy to let emotions take over, especially when you add in all the pressure from family and society.
It is.
And speaking of that, I think this case also shows the special challenges that couples face in cultures where arranged marriages are common.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
You're right. In those situations, there's an extra layer of complexity.
Right.
The couple isn't just dealing with their own feelings and expectations, but also the expectations of their families and their community.
And it seems like the court really understood that.
Yeah, they did.
Remember how they were practically begging the couple to try mediation?
I do. And I think their strong support for mediation is a good lesson for all of us.
Yeah.
No matter what our background is.
Right.
Mediation gives couples a neutral space to talk about what they need and how they see things,
Right.
work through their differences, and come up with solutions together.
I really appreciate that the court saw the potential of mediation to calm things down.
Me too.
And maybe even lead to a better outcome. They even suggested that mediation could be helpful in cases where a marriage is just beyond repair.
Yeah, which is pretty forward thinking.
It's a powerful message. They're basically saying that even when a marriage is falling apart, there's still a way to end things with dignity and respect.
Right.
And to minimize the hurt for everyone involved.
I agree.
It makes me think about how we often approach conflict in a really aggressive way. Whether it's divorce or a business dispute or even a disagreement with a friend or family member.
Yeah.
We're so quick to get lawyers involved and take sides and refuse to budge.
That's true. And it seems like that's the attitude the court is trying to challenge.
Right.
They're suggesting a more cooperative way of resolving conflicts, one where we focus on understanding each other, being empathetic, and finding common ground.
So what does all of this mean for our listeners? What are some practical things they can take away from this case?
Well, first of all, it's a reminder that communication is crucial in any relationship.
Yeah.
It's not about avoiding conflict completely.
Right.
It's about learning how to deal with it in a healthy way.
And remember, asking for help early on can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Whether it's couples counseling or mediation.
Right.
Or even just talking to a trusted friend or family member. Sometimes an outside perspective can help us see things more clearly.
Yeah.
And find better ways to communicate.
This case also makes us think about the laws around marriage and divorce.
It does.
Are they really helping people and families? Are they keeping up with how society is changing? The Supreme Court saying that a marriage breaking down completely should be a valid reason for divorce is a good example of how laws need to adapt to the changing realities of relationships.
Absolutely. This is a conversation that's happening all over the world.
It is.
And it's one we should all be part of.
Yeah. What does marriage mean to us today in the 21st century?
Right.
How can we make sure our laws and social norms support healthy and happy relationships while also accepting the fact that sometimes separation is the best way forward?
Well said. It's a reminder that relationships are complicated.
They are.
And there's no one solution that fits every situation.
Right.
The most important thing is that we approach them with open communication, mutual respect, and a willingness to seek help when we need it.
I think the case Srinivas Rao and D.A. Deepa case might seem far removed from our lives, but the issues it brings up are universal.
They are.
It's a story about love and heartbreak and cultural pressures.
Right.
And how relationships are always changing.
It reminds us that even when there's conflict, there's always an opportunity to grow and learn and create a more compassionate future.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We encourage you to keep exploring these questions and having thoughtful conversations about how relationships are evolving in our ever-changing world.